The pop-up menu control is much like the pop-up element. It looks something like this, and although it doesn't look like a pop-up, it really is the same basic concept. This is useful for controls that don't supply their own context menu, and for those that do, you can handle the right-tapped event, create your own new pop-up menu instance, use the commands.add method to add commands to your instance of the pop-up menu class, and you'll need to create a new UI command instance for each item. And you can specify text and a method to run on selection of each item in the pop-up menu. When it's time to show the pop-up, you call the showForSelection async method. This displays the menu, waits for the user to select something asynchronously, and then runs the command associated with the item asynchronously once you're done. Now for elements that do supply their own context menu, you can replace the context menu. In that case, you'll handle the context menu opening event. You'll set the e.handled property to true, indicating that you have handled the context menu opening and they won't display the context menu. Then you supply your own context menu, as if the control didn't support one. Now, if you like, you can have the showForSelection async method return a command ID associated with the selected item. If you supply command IDs, that'll work. If you supply delegates, won't work, and you'll just need to run the delegates associated with each command ID. In other words, you can either supply a command ID for each item in your pop-up menu, or you can supply a delegate to a procedure that will run when you select each item. It's up to you how you want to handle selection of an item in a pop-up menu. You can use the return value of showForSelection async to determine which item the user selected, but only if you supplied command IDs. Those are numbers. And then you can take an action based on that return value. Our demo shows both techniques. I've loaded and run the context menu C# sample, which you can download from the sample site that I showed you earlier. Let's look at both of these examples and then examine the markup and code. Here, if I right-click or hover over this with my finger on a touchscreen, I can show the context menu. There are two items on the menu, Open With or Save Attachment. If I choose one, you can see it displays which one I selected. Right-click, choose the other one, and so on. You can see it also displays that the context menu was actually shown here. So that's one way to create a context menu. We'll see that the next example is used in a situation where there is a default context menu. That is, a text box has its own context menu. But in this case, we're replacing it. So I'll select some text, right-click, and here we have our own context menu, which is Copy, then a divider, then Highlight, then Lookup. If I choose one, you'll see that Lookup, which is context ID 3, was selected. I'll choose Copy, that's context ID 1. And it actually would have copied this to the clipboard if it actually did anything. Well, you've seen how these work. Let's review so you'll remember. This one is an image. We right-click to bring up the context menu. When I select either item, it just displays what I selected here in the output. In this example, we're working with a text box which has its own context menu, which we're replacing. If we select text, right-click, our context menu appears, and you see the three items in it, and it indicates which one we selected. All right, let's return to Visual Studio and review what that code is doing. I'm waiting for Visual Studio to stop running the project. There we go. And let's look at scenario 1. This is the one in which we right-click on an image to bring up the context menu. Here is the image, and you can see here that we have no event handler associated with it. Okay, but we do have a name, a grid.row, a horizontal alignment, and so on, but no event handler. Also note that we have a text block named output text block. It's important because that's where we'll be displaying the output text. Let's look at the code associated with this page. And here you can see that in the constructor for this page, the code hooks up the right tapped event of the image to be a right tapped event handler, passing in the right tapped event handler. Let's go down and look at that right tapped event handler here. Now in this case, we need to generate our menu. We create a new instance of the pop-up menu class. We add commands to that menu by calling the menu.commands.add method. And the method call expects a UI command instance. And a UI command instance takes as its constructor parameters text to be displayed, here are the two items we saw, and either a command ID or a delegate. Here we're passing a delegate, and this procedure will run. It takes a parameter, which is the command you selected, and we can retrieve the label property and put that into the text of the output text block. We'll see whatever you selected, the text. And then for the next one, we add another command to our menu. This time it's a new UI command with the text save attachment. When it's selected, we'll run this delegate procedure. It's an anonymous delegate, doesn't have a name. And you can see it has a parameter named command. And we retrieve the label property of that command and display it in that output text block. Now there is some tricky stuff going on here to try and figure out where to put the context menu. So whenever we right tap on the image, we not only generate the menu, but we need to figure out where to put it. We display the context menu as shown, and now call the show for selection async. That's the method that allows us to display the context menu and wait for a response. But show for selection async allows you to specify a rectangle indicating where you want to put this thing. Sender is the image we clicked on. We need to cast it as a framework element instead of just being an object, and we call getElementRect, which is right up here. Given a framework element, we'll do some calculations to determine where that is on the screen. You can investigate that if you're interested. We call show for selection async, and it does return back the chosen command. Since we didn't specify command IDs, it's returning a reference to the command delegate. It's already been run at this point, so we can just say if that code was never run, if it's null, in that case we display context menu was dismissed. In other words, perhaps you moved off without selecting something or pressed escape, or however you dismiss this pop-up menu. So this is one way to use a pop-up menu, using delegates associated with each of the UI command items which you add to the commands collection of the menu. Let's look at the other example. This one has a text box, and again we're going to right-click to bring up the context menu, but a text box already has a context menu, so we need to indicate that we have overridden the default behavior. Okay, so for this text block, is there any event handler attached to it? No, there is not. So, well, there it is actually, but still no code associated with it. So let's look at the code behind this page. And you can see that we have attached code to the context menu opening event of that text box. That's the event that occurs when the system is about to display the context menu. We call this procedure, which is right down here somewhere. There we are. And this one does the work. The first thing we have to do is tell the system that we have handled the context menu. So they shouldn't do it. Don't display your built-in context menu. Let me do it. That's what this code is saying. Let's get a reference to the sender as a text box. And if the selection length of the text box is greater than 0, it means something is selected. In that case, we create a new pop-up menu and we add items to that pop-up menu, but this time they look different. In this case, we're specifying text all right, a null value for the delegate, and a command ID that's a number, in this case 1, 2, or 3. We'll use those numbers later to tell which one you selected. To add a separator, you add a new UI command separator to the menu. You can see our 4 items, including the command separator, here. And again, we don't want to obscure content, so we have a procedure which calculates where to put this pop-up menu. And we pass that rectangle to the call to show for selection async, which stops and waits for you to select something. But it does it asynchronously. So it actually doesn't tie up the UI. It is actually using the await keyword to run the rest of this code once we get a value back. Chosen command will contain either null, meaning you didn't select anything, or 1, 2, or 3, because you provided command IDs in this case. We can retrieve chosen command.id. Chosen command is the return value here. Its ID property will be one of those numbers, actually. And if you selected case 1, we need to do the copy thing. If you selected case 2, we do the highlight thing, which we really don't do anything for. And case 3, we do the lookup thing, and again, we don't do anything. Now, for the copy, we actually do something. We retrieve the selected text, create a new data package, set the text of that data package, and then set the content of the clipboard to be that data package. So this actually does place text onto the clipboard. It's just a mock-up, but that example actually does something for real. In any case, you've seen 2 different ways to use pop-up menus. Now, I will mention that the 2 methods are kind of not related to the examples they're used in. For example, there's no reason to use this command ID option only when you're overriding an existing context menu. And back on the first example, there's no reason to specifically use the delegate concept when adding a context menu to a control that doesn't have one. Those can be interchanged. Doesn't matter which technique you use for reacting to the click. What does matter is which technique you use for displaying the context menu. If the control doesn't have a context menu of its own, you trap the right tapped event. If the control does have its own context menu, you trap the context menu opening event and make sure you set e.handled to be true so the built-in context menu doesn't appear when you right-click on the item. Now that you've seen a number of different controls, what if you want all your buttons in your application to share font information, a background brush, and more? You probably know the answer. You could set up properties for each individual button, but not only is that a pain, it's also incredibly inefficient and a bad idea because should you ever need to change any property for all of them, you'd have to revisit them all. A better solution is to create a style and apply it to each individual button. That way each button looks the same. This is easy to do, both in terms of creating your own styles and in terms of using built-in styles that are part of your application. We'll show both techniques, but let's start by creating your own simple style and applying it to several different buttons. I've created a new blank project in Visual Studio, and I'd like to start by pasting in some markup that defines the kinds of things I want to work with. Rather than watching me type this, let me go back to our text file and get this markup. Here we are. Let me paste it in within the grid. And as you'll see, what I've added here is a set of buttons. I have 3 buttons, width of 350 in a stack panel, and each one has different content and each one has the horizontal alignment set to stretch so it fills the whole stack panel it's sitting in. Now I'd like to define a style. And normally, if you're going to define a style that applies to more than one control, that's kind of the point, you want to define it as part of a resource. Now you can define resources locally on a page, or you can define them in resource libraries, or you can define them in app.xaml. For now, I don't want to dig too deep into creating resources, so here I will just create a page.resources section and create the style I want to use inside that resources. Let me go get that style, and that's here, and we'll discuss it once I've gotten it. I typed this in already, again, so you wouldn't have to watch me do it. And there's our style. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the basic concept is the style consists of a set of properties that define it, in this case a key, I'll call it colorful button style, and a target type, that is an element type that we're going to apply this to, and then a group of setter elements. Each setter has a property attribute and a value attribute. You specify the name of the property you want to set and the value of the property you want to set. We set the font family to Verdana, the font size to 32, the margin to 5, the font weight to bold, etc. We also down here have a more complex property. We have a gradient brush, so we're setting the foreground, and you can't say value equals quote. Well, you can't define an attribute that. Well, you can't define a gradient that way. So you can also use the object.property syntax, creating a child element that defines a property's value. Since this is too complex to be described as a simple string attribute, you have to use this syntax. All right, so we've defined the style now. Let's go set that style for each of the buttons. There are a number of ways we can do this, but I want to show you the method using Visual Studio to do it first. Let me select the button, go to the Properties window. I need to display the Properties window, don't I? I'll press F4 to do that. I need to find the style property of the button. Now, the easiest way to find that is to use the search box. I have to type it right, of course. There's the style property. It exists in the miscellaneous section, so next time you know that. I'll choose the little button to the right, and this allows me to choose a local resource. Here, you find all the built-in resources that are part of the project, and in addition, colorful button style, which we just defined. Choosing colorful button style changes the styles for that button. Let me go to the second button and change its style property. Again to a local resource, colorful button style. Once more for the third button, style, local resource, colorful button style. So now all three buttons share the same style. And if I was to go and change something about that style, let's say, for example, the margin isn't just 5, but it has a 5 pixel margin on the left, a 5 pixel margin on the top, a 25 pixel margin on the right, and then a 0 pixel margin on the bottom, you can see that we changed the style for each of those three buttons. Now, you can override the behavior of the style in any given button. I can go to a particular element, say here's our first button. Let me set the margin for this button to be 25. And now the first button has its own unique settings for the margin, and the other two buttons get each of their settings for margin from the style that we created. So far, we've created a simple style and applied it explicitly to each of the buttons in this simple application.